Mark Travers wasn't expecting much from this trip. As the mechanic on board the Stellar Nomad, a rundown cargo ship hauling trade goods across the galaxy, his job was usually dull. Routine maintenance, fixing the occasional reactor leak, tightening loose bolts, it was tedious, but it paid the bills. He didn't need excitement, he just needed the credits to keep going. However, excitement found him when the ship's alarm blared one evening, accompanied by a deafening explosion that rocked the vessel to its core. What the hell, Dash? Mark sprang to his feet, heart pounding. The Stellar Nomad wasn't the newest ship in the fleet, but it was reliable. There shouldn't have been any major malfunctions, not with the routine inspections he had performed just days before. The emergency lights flickered as the ship buckled under a second explosion. Mark's stomach flipped as the gravity systems briefly failed, and he found himself hovering in midair before being slammed back to the ground when the gravity kicked back in. Not good, he muttered, rubbing his shoulder and wincing. There was no time to think. The air was filled with the metallic screech of the ship tearing itself apart. The crew comms were dead, and as Mark stumbled out of the engine bay, smoke was already filling the corridors. He could hear the groaning of the hull, and in the distance, the hissing sound of air escaping into the vacuum of space. He darted down the corridor toward the life pods. The sound of explosions reverberated behind him, one after the other, like the ship was being torn apart by an unseen force. He didn't have time to figure out what caused the disaster. His only concern was getting out alive. As Mark reached the escape pod bay, he cursed under his breath. The lights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows across the room. He could see that some of the pods had already launched, their docks empty. Others had been destroyed, crushed by debris from the ship's violent shaking. No, Mark grunted, throwing himself at the nearest intact pod. His fingers flew across the control panel, initiating the emergency launch sequence. There was no time to grab supplies, no time to check if anyone else had made it. The ship was breaking apart, and if he didn't leave now, there wouldn't be anything left of him to rescue. The door hissed shut behind him, sealing him inside the tiny capsule. Mark's breath was shallow as he strapped himself into the seat, his hands trembling. Through the small viewport, he saw the ship's hull glowing from internal fires, debris floating weightlessly in the vacuum. It was worse than he had thought. With a lurch, the pod ejected, rocketing away from the disintegrating Stellar Nomad and into the cold void of space. Mark gripped the sides of his seat, watching as the ship that had been his home for the past 6 months crumbled into a cloud of fiery debris. A sudden jolt snapped his attention to the controls. The pod's emergency navigation system had kicked in, locking onto the nearest planetary body in uncharted world, its surface barely visible through swirling clouds of sand and dust. There was no time to think about where he was going. He was on a collision course, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Mark gritted his teeth as the pod hit the planet's atmosphere. The hull vibrated violently as the friction built up, flames licking the windows as the pod hurtled downward. He could feel the heat building, sweat dripping down his brow. The console screamed warnings at him, but he was helpless to do anything except hold on. The descent seemed to last an eternity, but finally, the pod punched through the atmosphere. Below him stretched an endless, desolate landscape, a sea of dunes and rocky outcroppings, with no signs of life as far as the eye could see. "This is just great," Mark muttered, his stomach flipping as the pod continued its rapid descent. Out of the frying pan and into the fire. The pod hit the ground with a bone-jarring crash. The impact knocked the breath out of him, and for a few moments, Mark's world was a blur of dust, pain, and the metallic groaning of the pod settling into the sand. When he finally regained his senses, everything was still. The pod had come to rest at an odd angle, half buried in the soft dunes. Mark coughed, tasting blood in his mouth, but he was alive. "Could be worse," he mumbled, unbuckling himself from the seat. His body screamed in protest as he moved, his muscles bruised and his ribs aching, but nothing seemed broken. The pod was a wreck. One of the panels had short-circuited, sparking occasionally. The emergency systems had kicked in, keeping the pod's environment stable for the moment, but the flashing red lights indicated he didn't have long before the life support failed. He needed to get out. Kicking open the emergency release, Mark staggered out into the harsh sunlight of the planet's surface. The heat hit him immediately dry, oppressive. He shaded his eyes, squinting against the glare. Sand stretched out in every direction, broken only by jagged cliffs far in the distance. Great. Stranded on a desert planet. Alone. He took stock of his situation. There was little in the way of supplies in the pod, just a basic survival kit, some water, a ration pack, and a flare gun. He grabbed what he could and stuffed it into a small satchel. His trusty wrench, always clipped to his belt, was still there, a reassuring weight in his hand. Mark surveyed the horizon, looking for any sign of civilization, anything that might offer shelter or help. As his eyes adjusted, he noticed something faint on the horizon, a glint of metal, almost imperceptible in the heat haze. It wasn't part of his ship. Whatever it was different. Curiosity sparked, and Mark set off in its direction. The walk was grueling, each step sinking into the loose sand, but he kept his pace steady. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dunes. As he got closer, he realized the object wasn't just debris, it was a spacecraft, half buried in the sand. It wasn't human. Mark's heart skipped a beat. The design was unlike anything he had ever seen, sleek, with a strange, organic curvature to its form, almost as if it had grown out of the earth rather than crashed into it. His mind raced with possibilities. Could it be a probe? A shipwreck from some other mission? As he approached, the air around the ship seemed to hum with a strange energy. The hull shimmered under the fading light, casting an ethereal glow over the desert. But then, a movement from the wreckage caught his eye. Something or someone was alive inside. Mark crouched low, his hand instinctively gripping his wrench as he edged closer. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the open hatch of the alien craft. Inside, he could see figures, 3 of them, moving slowly, their forms silhouetted against the fading light. They weren't human. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He had no idea who or what these beings were, but one thing was certain, he wasn't as alone on this planet as he had thought. Mark's heart raced as he crouched behind a nearby dune, his eyes locked on the alien spacecraft. The strange, sleek ship was unlike anything he'd ever seen, a fusion of metal and organic shapes, with intricate designs etched along its shimmering hull. It was half buried in the sand, but it was clear this wasn't wreckage from a human vessel. This was something else entirely, and from the faint flicker of lights inside, it wasn't abandoned. 3 figures moved within the wreckage. He couldn't make out details at first, just shifting shadows and the occasional glint of light off their bodies. They were tall, slender, and graceful, moving with an ease that suggested they were injured but not incapacitated. Mark's instinct was to stay hidden, but the wrench in his hand felt heavier than usual. He was no fighter, but he wasn't about to let himself be ambushed. Taking a deep breath, he crept closer, skirting the perimeter of the ship. His boots crunched softly in the sand, the sound nearly drowned out by the desert wind. He edged around the side of the vessel until he could see through a crack in the hull, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, the 3 figures came into focus. They were unmistakably humanoid but not human. Their bodies were elongated and elegant, with shimmering, iridescent skin that reflected the dim light of the dying sun. Each of them had strikingly different hues, one a deep shade of sapphire blue, another a bright emerald green, and the third, standing slightly apart from the others, was a radiant silver, her skin almost glowing. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Alien. Truly alien. The silver-skinned one, taller and seemingly the leader, moved to inspect a control panel, her slender fingers brushing over a series of holographic symbols that glowed faintly under her touch. She winced in pain, cradling her arm as she worked. Mark could see that she and the others were injured, their sleek, form-fitting suits torn in places, revealing strange, glistening technology embedded into their bodies. For a moment, Mark considered retreating. Maybe he could find another way off this planet. Maybe he didn't need to get involved. But another part of him, perhaps the part that had spent years fixing broken machines and helping people in need, compelled him to act. He couldn't just leave them, could he? Summoning his courage, he stepped out from behind the wreckage and called out, "Hey! Do you need help?" The figures froze. In an instant, the atmosphere shifted from quiet desperation to tense alertness. The silver-skinned alien spun toward him, her glowing violet eyes narrowing as they locked onto him. Mark instinctively raised his hands, trying to show he meant no harm. "Whoa, whoa. I'm not here to hurt you," he said quickly. "I crashed too. My ship's gone. I saw your ship, thought maybe you could use some help." The silver-skinned alien narrowed her eyes, studying him. The others exchanged quick, musical words in a language that was completely alien to Mark's ears. It sounded like a blend of notes and tones, almost like singing, yet filled with an underlying tension. Mark swallowed hard. For a few agonizing seconds, they just stared at each other, and he wondered if approaching had been a fatal mistake. Then, the silver-skinned leader stepped forward cautiously, her voice soft but commanding. "You. Crash? Human?" Mark nodded. "Yeah. Mechanic, actually. Name's Mark. I don't know where I am, but I figured he gestured toward the wreckage. You could use a hand?" The alien blinked slowly, her violet eyes flickering with curiosity. She glanced at her companions, then back at Mark. After a moment, she spoke again, her voice halting, as if searching for the right words in his language. "I am Zyra. Leader. You fix things?" "Yeah, that's what I do," Mark said, a little more confidently now. He was relieved to be able to communicate, even if the language barrier was awkward. "I can try to help if you've got damage to your systems. I don't know your tech, but if it's broken, I can figure it out." Zyra's lips pressed together in a line, clearly debating her next move. Behind her, the blue-skinned alien Lyra, Mark would later learn, watched with sharp, suspicious eyes. The third, emerald-skinned alien, Zira, was more focused on nursing a wound on her side, glancing up only occasionally. Finally, Zyra nodded. "We need help." "Crash bad?" "No, leave this place." Mark exhaled in relief. "All right then. Let me take a look." He stepped closer to the ship, his nerves still on edge, but bolstered by the fact that they weren't attacking him. Zyra stepped aside, and as Mark entered the ship's interior, he marveled at the advanced technology surrounding him. Holographic interfaces flickered weakly, the walls seemed to pulse with a faint bioluminescence, and the air inside had a slightly electric charge, like walking into a room full of static. Zyra pointed to a console near the center of the room, where several wires and components were sparking intermittently. Mark knelt down, inspecting the damage. It was more complex than anything he'd ever worked on, but the principles weren't entirely foreign. Power flow, circuit breakers, input-output systems, different parts of the galaxy, same basic rules. "I can bypass some of this damage, but it looks like your main power relay is fried," Mark said after a moment. "You have any spare components?" Zyra frowned, her understanding of his technical jargon incomplete, but she gestured toward a storage compartment near the rear of the ship. Mark rummaged through the alien tools and materials, pulling out what looked like the alien equivalent of a power cell. He set to work, feeling their eyes on him as he tinkered with the unfamiliar technology. As he worked, the tension between him and the alien women began to ease slightly. Zyra stood nearby, watching his every move with curiosity. Occasionally, she would ask a question in her broken English, her voice soft and melodic, and Mark would answer as best he could. "You travel alone?" Zyra asked at one point. Mark shook his head. I was part of a crew. But the ship dashed, he gestured vaguely to the sky. Something happened. Explosions. Didn't get a chance to find out what. Next thing I knew, I was in a pod headed here. Zyra tilted her head, a look of understanding passing between them. We attacked. Enemy unknown. Weapons. Powerful. She paused, struggling for the right words. Our ship, protect us, but damage, too great. Mark nodded. Looks like we're both stuck, then. By the time he finished his repairs, the ship's power systems had stabilized, and the lights flickered on with a steady hum. The atmosphere inside the ship lightened, though the damage was far from completely fixed. Mark sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his brow, satisfied with his work for the moment. That should hold for now, he said, looking up at Zyra. You'll need more than just patches to get this thing off the ground again, though. Zyra gave him a small, grateful nod. You. Help. We. Grateful. Mark smiled slightly, feeling a strange sense of accomplishment. He hadn't expected to find anyone, let alone alien women, in need of a mechanic's skills, but here he was. Stranded on an unknown planet with 3 alien women and a broken ship. Well, he said, standing and stretching his sore muscles, I guess we're stuck here together for a while. Zyra's lips curled into a faint smile, her glowing eyes softening as she regarded him. Yes. Together. As the sun set over the alien desert, Mark realized his life had just taken a turn he never could have imagined. Stranded, but no longer alone, his survival and maybe even something more depended on the strange bond forming between him and these alien women. But as he looked out across the barren landscape, he couldn't shake the feeling that this planet held more secrets than they realized. Something was out there, and whatever it was, it hadn't revealed itself yet. Days passed, blending into one another under the harsh sun and cold nights of the alien desert. Mark, Zyra, Lyra, and Zira fell into an unspoken routine, their shared goal of repairing the ship slowly evolving into something deeper. Despite the language barrier and their cultural differences, Mark and the alien women began to forge a strange but unmistakable bond. Mark had established a makeshift camp outside the ship, using what little supplies he had salvaged from his life pod and the wrecked alien vessel. They cooked food over a small fire at night, though Mark found their alien rations tasteless and bland. Still, the Australians were gracious in their hospitality, sharing what they had, and Mark felt oddly at ease in their company. His daily work revolved around fixing the ship's systems. Though the alien technology was far more advanced than anything he'd encountered, the fundamental principles weren't entirely foreign. Power systems, engine components, control interfaces, they all followed basic mechanical laws, even if their design was far more intricate. As he worked, Zyra often stood beside him, her violet eyes studying his every movement. She had picked up more English over the days, her speech halting but improving, and her curiosity about Mark's skills and human technology was evident. "Why, you do this?" Zyra asked one evening as they worked on the ship's auxiliary power grid. Mark wiped the sweat from his forehead and glanced at her, unsure how to explain it simply. "I guess. I just like fixing things. Figuring out how they work, how to make them run again. It's what I've always done." Zyra tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "You make things live again." Mark chuckled. "Yeah, I suppose you could say that." Their conversations were still stilted, but there was a warmth growing between them. Mark had always been a loner, traveling from one job to the next, never really making strong connections. But out here, in the isolation of this barren world, he found himself appreciating the quiet companionship of these strange, graceful beings. It was unexpected, but not unwelcome. Lyra, the blue-skinned one, was more reserved, her watchful eyes always scanning the horizon as if expecting danger to appear at any moment. She rarely spoke to Mark, but when she did, her words were sharp and concise, delivered in a low, musical tone. Zira, with her emerald green skin, was quieter still, often focused on repairing her own injuries or the advanced technology embedded into her body. Zyra, however, was different. There was a calm authority about her, a quiet strength that commanded respect from the others. She seemed to carry the weight of leadership with grace, even in the face of their dire situation. Over time, Mark found himself gravitating toward her, drawn by her intelligence and the way she seemed to understand him even when words failed them both. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the dunes, Mark sat by the fire, inspecting a broken power cell he'd scavenged from the ship. Zyra sat beside him, her hands resting on her knees, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You good at this," she said, watching him work. Mark smiled. "I've had a lot of practice." She leaned closer, her eyes scanning the delicate wires and circuits he was repairing. "Your world, your people, they make many things like this?" He paused for a moment, thinking about Earth and the life he'd left behind. "Yeah. We make all kinds of things. Ships, machines, computers. Most people don't really think about how they work. They just expect them to, you know?" Zyra nodded slowly, her gaze softening as she regarded him. "You think about how things work. This is why you help us?" Mark shrugged, feeling a little self-conscious. "Maybe. But honestly, I don't know what else I'd do. We're stranded here together, and fixing your ship is our best chance of getting off this rock." Zyra was silent for a moment, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Then, almost hesitantly, she reached out and touched his hand. "We grateful, Mark. You save us." The touch startled him. Her skin was cool, almost metallic, but there was a warmth in the gesture that made him feel strangely comforted. He looked at her, their eyes meeting in the flickering light. There was an unspoken connection between them, something beyond words. "Just doing what I can," Mark said quietly, unsure how to respond to the unexpected intimacy of the moment. Before Zyra could reply, a sudden sound shattered the calm, a deep, low rumble that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath them. Mark sprang to his feet, instinctively reaching for the wrench at his side, as Zyra and the others stiffened, their heads snapping toward the horizon. Lyra was already on her feet, her eyes scanning the darkening landscape. "Something comes," she said in her melodic but urgent voice. Mark's pulse quickened. "What is it? An animal?" Zyra shook her head, her expression grim. "No. Not animal. Guardians." Mark frowned. "Guardians? What do you mean?" Before Zyra could explain, the ground beneath them trembled again, the rumbling growing louder. From beyond the dunes, a massive shape began to emerge, towering, ancient, and unmistakably mechanical. Mark's eyes widened as he saw what looked like a gigantic machine, its metal frame glinting in the twilight, its movements slow but purposeful. "What the hell?" Mark whispered, his grip tightening on his wrench. The thing, whatever it was enormous. It moved on spindly, insect-like legs, its massive body adorned with long-forgotten markings that glowed faintly in the dark. It looked ancient, a relic of some forgotten civilization, but it was undeniably active and heading straight for them. "Guardians," Zyra repeated, her voice tense. "This world, not empty. They protect." Mark's mind raced as he tried to comprehend what was happening. "Protect from what?" "We didn't do anything." Lyra stepped forward, her voice cold and determined. "They do not care. We trespass. They will destroy us if we stay." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. "We need to get out of here. Can we move the ship?" Zyra shook her head, her expression tight with frustration. "Not ready. Engines not repaired. We stay, we die." Mark glanced back at the massive machine as it lumbered toward them, its legs sinking into the sand with each step. There was no time. The ship wasn't ready, and they were sitting ducks. We'll have to fight, then, Mark said, feeling a surge of adrenaline. It was crazy he had no idea how to fight a machine that size, but he wasn't about to let these alien women get wiped out. Not after all they'd been through. Zyra looked at him, her violet eyes filled with a strange mixture of fear and resolve. You fight? With us? Mark met her gaze, his voice steady. Yeah. I'm with you. Zyra, who had been silent for much of the time, stepped forward, her green skin glowing faintly in the darkness. We fight together. Lyra nodded, her blue skin shimmering as she drew what looked like a weapon from a compartment in her suit. It was sleek and unfamiliar, but deadly in appearance. Mark had no weapon of his own, but he gripped his wrench tighter, ready to use whatever tools he had. As the machine closed in, its massive, glowing eyes focused on them, Mark stood beside Zyra and the others, ready for the fight of his life. The strange bond they had formed over the past days had solidified into something more than just survival. They were in this together now, human and alien alike, standing against a threat far beyond anything Mark had ever faced. And as the Guardian loomed over them, its mechanical limbs ready to strike, Mark knew that whatever happened next, he wasn't alone. The Guardian towered over them, casting a colossal shadow across the desert as its glowing red eyes locked onto the small group. Every thudding step it took shook the ground, its insect-like legs sinking into the sand with mechanical precision. The ancient machine was covered in layers of weathered metal, etched with unfamiliar symbols that glowed faintly in the dying light. It had the air of something built long ago, forgotten by time, but it had reawakened, and it was ready to fulfill its purpose. Mark stood alongside Zyra, Lyra, and Zyra, his heart hammering in his chest. The wrench in his hand felt woefully inadequate against the behemoth before him, but there was no time for doubt. If they didn't fight, they would die. He glanced at Zyra, who was staring up at the Guardian with a look of calm intensity, her violet eyes reflecting the machine's eerie glow. How do we stop that thing? Mark asked, his voice tight with tension. Zyra's gaze flicked to him briefly before returning to the approaching Guardian. Guardians, protect this planet. Old technology. Weak, but powerful still. Weak? Mark muttered, watching as the massive machine raised one of its legs, preparing to crush them. I'm not seeing the weak part. Before he could say anything else, the Guardian's leg came down with terrifying force. Mark dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the impact as the ground exploded in a cloud of sand and debris. The sheer power of the machine's movement sent shockwaves rippling through the desert. Lyra and Zyra were already in motion. Lyra dashed forward, her blue skin shimmering as she dodged another strike from the Guardian's leg. She moved with inhuman speed, her sleek form darting between the machine's attacks like a phantom. In her hands, she held a weapon that glowed with a strange energy alien technology Mark didn't understand, but it seemed like their only hope. Zyra, despite her injuries, unleashed a barrage of energy blasts from a device embedded in her arm. The bright green bolts struck the Guardian's legs, sending sparks flying, but the machine barely seemed to notice. It lumbered forward, undeterred by their attacks, its eyes glowing brighter as it focused on the ship behind them. Mark scrambled to his feet, looking for anything he could use to help. He wasn't a soldier, he didn't have advanced weapons or combat training, but his mind raced with possibilities. The Guardian was old, its movements deliberate and slow, as if powered by an ancient source. It was protecting something, maybe this planet, maybe something buried deep beneath the surface. But it wasn't invincible. We need to take out its legs. Mark shouted, running toward the ship. He knew there were tools and supplies inside that might give him a fighting chance. It's too big to attack head-on. We have to bring it down. Zyra glanced at him, her expression sharp. Legs, weak point. Good plan. She relayed Mark's idea to Lyra and Zyra in their native tongue, their words flowing in that musical, melodic tone that seemed out of place in the chaos of battle. The two alien women nodded and shifted their tactics, focusing their attacks on the Guardian's legs. Lyra moved with even greater agility, weaving between the machine's lumbering limbs and targeting the joints where metal plates met. Mark reached the ship and dove inside, scrambling through the scattered tools and supplies. His mind raced as he searched for anything that could help. His hands fell on a plasma torch he had been using to repair the ship's interior earlier that day. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Grabbing the torch, Mark sprinted back outside, adrenaline fueling his every movement. The Guardian was bearing down on Zyra, who was using her strange, glowing weapon to fire concentrated blasts at its legs. The ground beneath them rumbled as the machine's massive feet sank deeper into the sand with every step. "Zyra!" Mark yelled, waving the plasma torch. "Keep it distracted. I'm going for the legs." She didn't hesitate. With a quick nod, Zyra surged forward, drawing the Guardian's attention with a barrage of energy blasts that sparked off its metal frame. The machine swung one of its massive legs toward her, but she dodged with grace, rolling across the sand and coming up ready for another attack. Mark gritted his teeth and ran toward the Guardian's nearest leg, his plasma torch sparking to life in his hand. The heat from the torch was intense, and he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him as he reached the base of the leg. Up close, the machine was even more terrifying, its sheer size dwarfing him as it moved with mechanical precision. With a deep breath, Mark thrust the plasma torch into the joint where the leg met the body, the blue flame cutting through the metal like a knife through butter. Sparks flew as the plasma seared through layers of ancient alloys, and the machine let out a low, ominous groan as if it could feel the damage. Come on, Mark muttered under his breath, his hands trembling as he worked. The Guardian's leg shifted, and for a moment, he thought it might crush him, but Zyra and Lyra kept up their assault, diverting the machine's attention just long enough for him to finish the cut. The Guardian's leg gave way with a deafening crack, the metal buckling under its own weight. The machine stumbled, its balance thrown off as it tried to compensate for the sudden loss of one of its supports. Mark barely had time to dive out of the way before the massive limb crashed into the ground, sending a shockwave through the desert. "We've got it off balance," Lyra shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "One more leg." Mark scrambled to his feet, panting and covered in sweat. His hands were shaking, but there was no time to stop. The Guardian was faltering, but it was far from defeated. Its remaining leg thudded into the sand, and its glowing red eyes blazed with renewed intensity. It was adapting, learning from their attacks. "We need to hit the power core," Zyra called out, her emerald skin glistening with sweat as she unleashed another barrage of energy blasts. "The head. It's in the head." Mark looked up at the towering machine, his mind racing. The head was far above them, out of reach unless they could bring the whole thing down. "Lyra!" Mark shouted, pointing to the remaining leg. "Can you cover me?" Lyra nodded, her blue eyes flashing with determination. "I'll hold it off. Do what you need to do." Without another word, Mark rushed toward the final leg, plasma torch in hand. He could feel the ground shaking beneath him as the Guardian's legs slammed into the sand, but he didn't stop. Lyra darted in front of the machine, drawing its attention with a series of quick, precise strikes that disrupted its sensors. Mark reached the base of the leg and ignited the plasma torch again. His heart pounded in his chest as he drove the torch into the joint, cutting through the metal as quickly as he could. The heat from the torch singed his skin, but he ignored the pain, focusing only on the task at hand. Finally, with a final, ear-splitting crack, the Guardian's last leg gave way. The massive machine lurched, its towering form swaying dangerously as it lost all balance. Mark threw himself to the ground as the Guardian collapsed, its metal body crashing into the sand with a thunderous boom that echoed across the desert. The dust settled, and for a moment, there was silence. Mark coughed, pulling himself to his feet as he looked up at the fallen machine. Its red eyes flickered weakly, the glow fading as its systems powered down. He could see the power core now, exposed in the head of the machine, a glowing orb of ancient energy, pulsing faintly. We did it. Mark breathed, his voice hoarse. Zyra stepped up beside him, her violet eyes scanning the remains of the Guardian. We together. Lyra and Zira joined them, their faces marked with exhaustion but triumphant. They had fought together, against all odds, and won. As the last light faded from the Guardian's eyes, Mark felt a deep sense of relief wash over him. They had survived. For now. But as he looked out across the endless desert, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The Guardians were old, but the technology that built them was far older and far more powerful than anything he had encountered before. Something had awakened on this planet, and whatever it wasn't finished with them yet. Zyra turned to Mark, her expression serious. More will come. Mark nodded, his mind already racing with thoughts of what they would face next. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't facing the unknown alone. Yeah, Mark said, his voice steady. But next time, we'll be ready. As the stars began to emerge in the alien sky, the strange bond between them felt stronger than ever. Human and alien, mechanic and warrior, they were no longer just survivors. They were a team. And together, they would face whatever challenges this planet had left to throw at them.